was going to be the one who was supposed to be here virtually when Sarah started talking, so I was getting ready to run out and get on my phone. But I'm glad that wasn't me, and I was also afraid that Adam would be looking at me from the screen while I was doing this and making faces, but so luckily that's not happening either. No, it's not. Can you see me, Adam? Okay. I have had the unique privilege of serving both in the DNRC as the Water Resources Division Administrator now, and DEQ as the Water Quality Division Administrator. And it, kind of bridging the gap is one of the things that intrigued me from going from a water quantity primarily based agency to overseeing a water quality agency. And in the West, we tend to separate those two. And I think a lot of the discussion we heard with this sage advice of legislators, past legislators, a lot of that was very much focused on water rights. And I had to actually chew on some of my old staff when they started setting up this conference, because it looked like it was going to be just water rights focused at the beginning, but they did a great job of pulling it all together. So, and I no longer can dock them pay, so that's useful too. But I want to take 1 second, speaking of service, to acknowledge a colleague of mine who passed over the weekend, John North, the Chief Legal Counsel for DEQ. He served the people of Montana for 48 years. So just keep his family in your thoughts. It's a sudden tragedy for us, and it's been hard to take. But any of those of you who knew John, he had an incredible depth of knowledge and commitment to the state, and he steadfastly refused to retire. So it's one of those things where please keep his family in your thoughts. So I'm talking about this right now. I'm going to just spend a couple minutes, and then I'll come back and talk again. But the first piece is really the policy differences and similarities between water quantity and water quality in the state of Montana. The similarities end pretty quickly, so I'll start with those. There's a constitutional underpinning for both. In the Montana State Constitution, there's the prior appropriation doctrine that was acknowledged in the Constitution and is implemented through the Water Use Act in state statute, and then there's the right to a clean and healthful environment and implemented, at least on a water perspective, through the Water Quality Act, and separately for my division through the Sanitation and Subdivisions Act. That's kind of where the similarities stop. So that they're both constitutionally acknowledged, their rights and protections that were acknowledged in the Constitution. But now I'll get into how they're different. And Sarah brought up that the states have primacy over water rights, and that in Montana, unlike several other states, in virtually every state that has the prior appropriation doctrine does it a little differently. But Montana is primarily a claims-based system. There's no requirement for measurement in those systems, and a small number of water rights, and Jan Langle or some of the DNRC staff can confirm the actual number, but a small number of the total, more than 200,000 water right claims have gone through the change process and really been firmed up through that process by DNRC. And then another relatively small number of new permits have been established, and some of those, depending on when they were established, have measurements requirements as well as consumed and diverted portions. But mostly, water rights in Montana is a claim-based system, unless they've gone through the permitting process post-1973 or the change process. And then there's exempt wells. And if anybody has, I'm going to go down the same path and run away from, like Senator Vinson, rather than talk about exempt wells, but I won't. And then when it comes to water quality, the state has delegated authority under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act from EPA. That authority brings with it certain requirements, including that our permitting is very science-based. It requires measurements. Those measurements feed into federal databases, and that our enforcement is also very much science-based. The EPA does retain continued oversight for much of the work that we do. including when we establish new water quality standards, including variances to water quality standards, TMDLs or water plans, so water quality planning. So there's still oversight, but we have delegated authority to carry out the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. Both quality and quantity have the definition beneficial use. These are, however, it's kind of like having twins that were separated at birth and they've never met. So they might look exactly the same when you look at them on the face, but there's really no system in the state to bring them together. And there's really the implementation and definition of beneficial use is different. For example, DEQ, we don't use the water rights on a stream and the beneficial uses of those water rights to establish what the beneficial uses are that need to be protected under the Clean Water Act. Similarly, in almost all cases, DNRC does not consider water quality when going through the change process. I think it's only when there is when the change has been challenged, there's an objection that says that there's a water quality impact. And some of the examples that this results in are just north of here, in the North Valley, there's a subdivision called North Star Subdivision, and we gave it, I think there were 5, 6 phases of that subdivision. DEQ gave all the phases of the subdivision approval. However, DEQ, they had not gone into DEQ to get change authorization to put for the water rights for all of the subdivision. And so they got what they saw as a vested right, but not the other vested right for a water quality purposes. It put everybody in a terrible situation. Homeowners couldn't sell homes. I think they were getting ready to develop the last phases. And luckily, the two agencies, DNRC, DEQ, were able to work together, come up with a process to ensure that ideally doesn't happen again in the future. Late season flows. When we are calculating really a standard for a permit, we look at kind of the lowest flow scenario. However, we really don't calculate at that same time. There's not a marriage, so that's really when the assimilative capacity of the stream is at its lowest for a new discharge. And I'm not getting into mixing zones yet, Steve. But really, when the assimilative capacity of the stream is lowest, that is also the time when water rights are at the peak demand for an over-appropriated stream. So it's one of those and the impacts, and our friends from FWP, also when the potential impact is greatest on aquatic life. So those aren't tied together, even though we use some of the same analyses or the same pinch points. And then economics. This is getting at mixing zones. So the economics of treatment, for wastewater treatment, can push people, make it so that it's more expensive, too expensive for them to continue to discharge. They stop discharging, even if that would have an impact on late season flows. And there isn't really a way for us to marry those two. And DEQ, one of the things we don't do is we don't tell people how to treat water. We say, here's the standards you have to meet in order to comply with your discharge permit. They go find, the discharger decides what is the cheapest, easiest way for them to meet the standards. That can be, I'm getting out of the stream, even if the water I'm leaving in the stream is a large portion of the late season flows. So those are some of the disconnects, and I'll come back a little bit later and hopefully talk about more hopeful things going forward. But Adam's going to kind of give us an experience from more broadly across the country, and I'm happy to hear what he has to say. Thank you.